The courthouse doors swung open with such force that every head in Desdemona, Texas turned to watch Grace Jensen being dragged through the dusty street by Sheriff Morton. Her wrists bound tight enough to leave marks, her chestnut hair falling loose from its pins as she stumbled over the uneven ground. It was August 1878, and the sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden buildings that lined Main Street, turning the air thick and oppressive as the townsfolk gathered to witness what they believed was the capture of a common thief. Grace's green eyes blazed with fury and fear as she was hauled up the courthouse steps, her simple cotton dress torn at the hem from where she had tried to run. Behind her, Mrs. Cornelius Vander Borg stood with her arms crossed, her expensive silk fan fluttering against her flushed face as she proclaimed loudly to anyone who would listen that the girl had stolen $300 from her personal safe, a fortune that could feed a family for a year. "I saw her with my own eyes," Mrs. Vander Borg declared, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Coming out of my study at 2:30 yesterday afternoon. When I checked my safe, the money was gone, all of it." Grace wanted to scream that it was a lie, that she had never set foot in the Vander Borg study, that she had been nowhere near their sprawling ranch house on the edge of town. But her protests had fallen on deaf ears since the moment the accusation had been made. She was just a seamstress, a girl who had come to Desdemona 6 months ago with nothing but a carpet bag and a skill with needle and thread. Mrs. Vander Borg was the wife of the wealthiest cattle baron in 3 counties. In a town like this, there was no question whose word would be believed. The inside of the courthouse was marginally cooler, though not by much. Judge Harlan sat behind his massive oak desk, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his eyes hard as flint as he surveyed Grace with obvious distaste. Sheriff Morton forced her into a chair before the bench, and Grace felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. "Grace Jensen," Judge Harlan began, his voice booming through the small courtroom, "you stand accused of theft in the amount of $300 from Mrs. Cornelius Vander Borg. How do you plead?" "Not guilty," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I never stole anything. I was not at the Vander Borg ranch yesterday afternoon." "Mrs. Vander Borg says otherwise," the judge replied, glancing at the elegant woman who had taken a seat in the front row. "She is a respected member of this community, and her testimony carries considerable weight." "Then let me provide testimony of my own," Grace insisted, leaning forward despite the sheriff's warning hand on her shoulder. "I was not there. I can prove it." But even as she said the words, Grace felt the cold weight of despair settling in her stomach. How could she prove where she had been? She had spent the afternoon alone, walking along the creek that ran behind the boarding house where she rented a small room. She had needed time to think, time to escape the suffocating heat of her tiny workspace and the constant demands of her customers. She had told no one where she was going. There had been no witnesses to her innocence. Judge Harlan was opening his mouth to speak when the courthouse doors opened again. And this time, every eye turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight streaming in from outside. Kade Callahan stepped into the courtroom with the easy confidence of a man who had faced down charging longhorns and survived winter storms that would have killed lesser men. He was 26 years old, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of Texas bluebonnets. His work clothes were dusty from the trail, his boots worn but well-maintained, and there was a set to his jaw that suggested he was a man who did not back down easily. Grace had seen him around town, of course. Everyone in Desdemona knew Kade Callahan. He worked as a ranch hand for the Lazy J, one of the smaller spreads that struggled to compete with operations like Vanderborg's empire. He kept to himself mostly, spoke when spoken to, and had a reputation for being honest to a fault and handy in a fight. Grace had never exchanged more than a polite nod with him, had never imagined that their paths would cross in any meaningful way. But now he was walking straight toward the judge's bench, his hat held respectfully in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear. "Pardon the interruption, Your Honor," Kade said, "but I could not help overhearing the charges being brought against Miss Jensen." Judge Harlan's eyebrows rose. "This is a court of law, Mr. Callahan, not a social gathering. If you have business here, state it plainly." "I do, sir." Kade turned slightly so that he could see both the judge and Grace, and for just a moment, their eyes met. Grace saw something in his expression that she could not quite name, a determination mixed with something softer, something that made her breath catch. "Miss Jensen could not have stolen that money yesterday afternoon because she was with me." The courtroom erupted into murmurs and gasps. Mrs. Vanderborg stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "That is absurd," she said. "This man is clearly lying to protect her." "I am not in the habit of lying, madam," Kade replied, his tone respectful but firm. "And I do not appreciate being called a liar." Judge Harlan held up his hand for silence, and gradually the noise subsided. "Mr. Callahan, you are claiming that Miss Jensen was in your company during the time the theft allegedly occurred." "Yes, sir. From noon until nearly supper time. We met down by Willow Creek, and we spent the afternoon together." Kade's expression did not waver, though Grace could see a muscle working in his jaw. Grace stared at him in complete bewilderment. It was a lie, a blatant fabrication, and she had no idea why he was offering it. They had not been together yesterday. She had been alone. But as she opened her mouth to say so, to correct this strange and dangerous falsehood, she caught the subtle shake of his head, the slight plea in his eyes. He was giving her an alibi, and if she contradicted him now, she would be condemning herself. "Is this true, Miss Jensen?" the judge asked. Turning his penetrating gaze on her, Grace's mind raced. If she said yes, she was complicit in a lie. If she said no, she would likely be found guilty of a crime she did not commit and face imprisonment or worse. The choice, when it came down to it, was not really a choice at all. "Yes," she heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I was with Mr. Callahan." The courtroom exploded again, this time with outrage and scandal. An unmarried woman spending an entire afternoon alone with a man. It was nearly as damning as theft in the eyes of Desdemona's respectable citizens. But it was not a crime, not technically, and more importantly, it meant Grace could not have been at the Vanderborg ranch. Mrs. Vanderborg's face had gone scarlet with fury. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "Judge Harlan, surely you cannot take the word of a drifter cowboy over mine." "I am not a drifter, madam," Kade said quietly. "I have worked at the Lazy J for 3 years, and before that I was in Wyoming with the cattle drives. I am a working man, but I am an honest one." Judge Harlan stroked his beard thoughtfully, his eyes moving from Kade to Grace and back again. "This is highly irregular," he said finally. "Mrs. Vanderborg, are you certain of the time when you saw Miss Jensen at your ranch?" "I told you. It was 2:30, Mrs. Vanderborg insisted, though there was a slight hesitation in her voice now. "And Mr. Callahan claims Miss Jensen was with him at that time. Do you have any other witnesses who can place her at your property?" Mrs. Vanderborg opened and closed her mouth several times, her fan working frantically. "I know what I saw," she said, but the certainty had drained from her voice. "Perhaps," Judge Harlan said slowly, "you were mistaken about who you saw. It would not be the first time an honest citizen confused one young woman for another, particularly from a distance. It was a face-saving way out, and Mrs. van der Borg seized it with obvious reluctance. "I suppose it is possible," she admitted stiffly. "The light in the hallway can be quite dim." Then, in the absence of any concrete evidence, and in light of Mr. Callahan's testimony providing Miss Jensen with an alibi, I have no choice but to dismiss these charges. Judge Harlan brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Miss Jensen, you are free to go. However, I would strongly advise you to be more mindful of your reputation in the future. A young, unmarried woman should not be spending unchaperoned afternoons with young men, regardless of the circumstances." Grace barely heard the lecture that followed. She was too busy trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand why Kade Callahan had just risked his own reputation to save hers. When Sheriff Morton finally untied her wrists, her hands were numb and trembling. She stood on shaky legs and turned to find Kade waiting by the door. The other spectators were filing out, their voices buzzing with gossip that would fuel conversations for weeks to come. Mrs. van der Borg swept past without a glance, her dignity clearly wounded. "Mr. Callahan," Grace began as she approached him, but he shook his head. "Not here," he said quietly. "Let us walk." They stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun together, and Grace was acutely aware of the stares that followed them down the courthouse steps. The story would be all over town within the hour. The seamstress and the cowboy, caught in a scandalous liaison. It was hardly the truth, but it would stick to both of them like tar. Kade led her away from Main Street, down a narrow alley between the general store and the telegraph office, and then out toward the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrubland and scattered mesquite trees. Neither of them spoke until they were well away from listening ears. Finally, Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why did you do that?" Kade settled his hat back on his head, squinting against the sun. "You were innocent," he said simply. "I could see it on your face, and that woman was lying. Mrs. van der Borg, she did not see you at her ranch. I would stake my life on it. But she needed someone to blame for that missing money, and you were convenient." Kade's expression was grim. "Rich folk like the van der Borgs, they think they can do whatever they want to people like us. Push us around, accuse us of things, ruin our lives without a second thought." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the heat. "You lied for me. You told the judge we were together when we were not. Why would you do that for a stranger?" "Because it was the right thing to do." Kade looked at her directly then, and Grace felt something shift in her chest at the intensity in his blue eyes. "And you are not entirely a stranger. I have seen you around town. I know you work hard, keep to yourself, do not cause trouble. When I heard about the accusation, I knew it had to be false. But now everyone thinks," Grace trailed off, her cheeks heating. "They think we were together, alone for hours." "I know," Kade's jaw tightened. "I am sorry for that. I did not think it through as well as I should have. I just knew I had to stop them from convicting you of something you did not do." Grace studied him, this tall cowboy with the honest eyes and the strong hands, and felt something warm unfurling inside her. "You barely know me. That is true enough." A small smile tugged at the corner of Kade's mouth. "But I would like to change that if you are willing. Seems to me we have already been through something significant together. Might as well get to know each other properly." Despite everything, despite the fear that was still thrumming through her veins and the uncertainty of what would happen next, Grace found herself smiling back. "I suppose that would be acceptable, given the circumstances. Good." Kade glanced back toward town, where the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. "Would you let me walk you home, Miss Jensen? I suspect you have had enough excitement for one day." "More than enough," Grace agreed. "And please call me Grace. Grace." He said her name carefully, as if testing how it felt on his tongue. "I am Kade. I know." She fell into step beside him as they began walking toward the boarding house on the far side of Desdemona. "Everyone knows who you are, Mr. Callahan." "Kade," he corrected gently. "If we are to be on first-name terms." They walked in companionable silence for a while, and Grace found herself sneaking glances at him when she thought he was not looking. There was something solid and dependable about him, something that made her feel safer than she had felt since arriving in this dusty Texas town. He had saved her today. There was no question about that. Without his intervention, she would likely be sitting in a jail cell right now, waiting for a trial that would almost certainly end in conviction. "I truly was alone yesterday afternoon," she said quietly as they turned down the street that led to her boarding house. "I went walking by the creek because I needed to clear my head. There was no one with me." "I know," Kade replied. "I could tell you were confused when I said we had been together." "Then why?" Grace began, but Kade interrupted her. "Because the truth was not going to help you. You had no alibi, no way to prove your innocence. All you had was your word against Mrs. Vander Borgs, and we both know how that would have ended." He paused, pushing a hand through his dark hair. "I gave you what you needed, a witness who could place you somewhere else at the time of the theft. But you lied under oath." "I did." Kade did not look troubled by this admission. "And I would do it again in a heartbeat. Sometimes a lie in service of justice is better than a truth that serves injustice." Grace considered this as they reached the steps of her boarding house, a narrow two-story structure with faded yellow paint and a sagging porch. Mrs. Thornton, the proprietor, was sitting in her rocking chair by the door, her sharp eyes missing nothing as Grace and Kade approached. "Miss Jensen," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice dripping with disapproval. "I heard about the proceedings at the courthouse. I run a respectable establishment here. I will not have my other tenants subjected to scandal." Grace felt her stomach drop. "Mrs. Thornton, please, I did not steal anything." "The charges were dismissed." "That may be, but the talk all over town is about you and this cowboy spending the afternoon together in some inappropriate manner." Mrs. Thornton's gaze shifted to Kade, assessing him from head to toe. "I cannot have that sort of behavior under my roof." "Madam," Kade said, stepping forward, "I assure you that Miss Jensen conducted herself with perfect propriety. Any rumors to the contrary are just that, rumors. Be that as it may, Mr. Callahan, I have a reputation to maintain. Miss Jensen will need to find other lodgings." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. "You are evicting me. I am giving you 1 week to find somewhere else to live." Mrs. Thornton stood, brushing down her skirts. "I am sorry, but that is my final word on the matter." She disappeared inside, leaving Grace standing on the steps with Kade beside her. For a moment, Grace just stood there trying to process this latest catastrophe. She had been accused of theft, nearly convicted, saved by a lie, and now she was losing her home, all in the space of a single day. "Grace," Kade said softly, and she realized she was crying, hot tears spilling down her cheeks despite her best efforts to hold them back. "I am sorry," she managed, swiping at her face with her hands. "This is not your concern." "It is absolutely my concern," Kade countered. "This happened because I gave you that alibi. I did not think about the consequences, about how people would react. This is my fault." "No." Grace took a shaky breath, trying to compose herself. "This is Mrs. Vander Borg's fault for making false accusations, and Mrs. Thornton's fault for being more concerned with gossip than with truth. You tried to help me. You did help me. I would be in jail right now if not for you." Kade looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised both of them. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was brief, barely there, but it sent a spark of electricity through Grace's entire body. "I will help you find a new place to stay," he said. "And if anyone gives you trouble, they will have to answer to me." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. There was something happening here, something that went beyond gratitude or convenience. She could feel it in the way Kade was looking at her, in the way her heart was beating faster than it should. They were strangers bound together by a lie that had saved her life, and now they were becoming something more, something she could not quite name yet. "I should go inside," she said finally. "I need to think about what to do next." "Of course." Kade stepped back, giving her space. "But Grace, if you need anything at all, you can find me at the Lazy J. Just ask for me." "Thank you, Kade." She meant it with every fiber of her being. "For everything." She watched him walk away, his tall figure growing smaller as he headed back toward the center of town. Only when he had disappeared around a corner did she finally go inside, climbing the narrow stairs to her small room on the second floor. The space was sparse but clean. A narrow bed, a washstand, a small table where she did her sewing. Grace sank down onto the bed and let herself have a moment to simply breathe. Her world had been turned upside down today, and she had no idea how to right it again. But as she sat there in the fading light, she found her thoughts returning again and again to Kade Callahan, to the way he had stood up for her without hesitation, to the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. She barely knew him, but he had changed the course of her life today. And somehow, she suspected, this was only the beginning. The next morning brought no relief from the August heat. Grace woke early, her small room already stifling, and dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses. She had work to do. Mrs. Patterson had commissioned a new Sunday dress, and the fabric needed to be cut and pinned before the weekend. But as she gathered her sewing supplies, she could not stop thinking about the deadline Mrs. Thornton had given her. 1 week to find new lodgings in a town where everyone would now be whispering about her supposed indiscretion with Kade Callahan. She was pinning the pattern pieces to Mrs. Patterson's fabric when someone knocked on her door. Grace looked up, surprised. She rarely had visitors, especially this early in the morning. "Come in," she called. The door opened to reveal Mary Sullivan, one of the other boarders. Mary was a few years older than Grace, a schoolteacher with kind brown eyes and a practical manner. The two women had shared a few pleasant conversations over breakfast, but they were not close friends. "Good morning, Grace," Mary said, slipping inside and closing the door behind her. "I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all. Is something wrong?" Mary settled herself on the edge of the bed, her expression troubled. "I heard about what happened yesterday, about the theft accusation and the trial." Grace felt her stomach clench. "I did not steal anything, Mary, I swear it. I believe you." Mary reached out and took Grace's hand. "I know you, Grace. You would never do such a thing. But I also heard about Kade Callahan's testimony and about Mrs. Thornton's decision to ask you to leave. News travels fast in Desdemona. It always does." Mary squeezed her hand gently. "I wanted you to know that I do not believe the gossip. I know you are a good person, and whatever happened between you and Mr. Callahan is your own business." Grace felt tears pricking at her eyes again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you, Mary. That means more than you know. I wish I could help you with the lodging situation, but I am barely making ends meet on a teacher's salary as it is. I cannot afford to rent a place of my own, let alone help you find one." "I understand. I will figure something out." After Mary left, Grace tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering. She needed to find a place to live, and quickly. There were not many options in Desdemona for a single woman of limited means. Most of the respectable boarding houses would likely refuse her now, given the scandal. She could try to find a room above one of the shops on Main Street, but those were expensive and often dirty. She was still pondering her options when another knock came at the door. This time, when she opened it, she found herself face to face with Kade Callahan. He looked uncomfortable standing in the narrow hallway of the boarding house, his hat in his hands, his broad shoulders seeming to fill the entire space. "Morning, Grace. I hope I am not intruding." "Kade." Grace's heart did a strange little flip at the sight of him. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were all right after yesterday." His blue eyes searched her face with concern. "And I heard about Mrs. Thornton giving you notice." "How did you?" Grace began, then laughed weakly. "Of course. Everyone knows everything in this town." "It is one of the less charming aspects of small-town life," Kade agreed. "May I come in? I have an idea I would like to discuss with you." Grace hesitated. Having Kade in her room, even with the door open, would only fuel more gossip. But then again, her reputation was already in tatters. What did it matter now? "All right," she said, stepping back to let him enter. Kade looked around the small space, taking in the modest furnishings and the sewing work spread across the table. "You do good work," he observed, nodding at the partially assembled dress. "Thank you. It pays the bills, or at least it did until yesterday." Grace clasped her hands together, suddenly nervous. "What was this idea you wanted to discuss?" Kade turned to face her fully, and Grace could see that he was nervous too, though he was doing his best to hide it. "I know you need a place to stay, and I know that most of the folks in town are going to make that difficult for you because of what happened at the courthouse. That is putting it mildly. So I have been thinking." Kade took a breath. "The Lazy J has a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, but there is also a small cabin on the property that used to be the foreman's quarters. It has been empty for a year now, ever since old Jim retired and moved to San Antonio. It is not fancy, but it is solid. 2 rooms, a good roof, a stove for cooking." Grace stared at him. "You are offering me a place to stay at the ranch. I spoke to Mr. Jenkins, the owner, this morning. I told him about your situation, and he said you would be welcome to use the cabin. The rent would be minimal, just enough to cover upkeep, and you would be safe there. No one would bother you." It was a generous offer, almost too generous. Grace felt a warm rush of gratitude mixed with confusion. "Kade, I do not understand. Why are you doing all this for me?" Kade looked at her steadily. "Because it is the right thing to do. Because you deserve better than what this town has given you. And because," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "I would like to get to know you better, Grace Jensen. I would like to spend time with you if you will let me." Grace's breath caught in her throat. There it was, laid out plainly between them. He was interested in her, not just as a damsel to rescue, but as a woman. And God help her, she was interested in him too. She had been thinking about him almost constantly since yesterday, about his steady presence and his kind eyes and the way he had stood up for her without hesitation. "I would like that too," she said softly. "But Kade, if I move out to the Lazy J, people will talk even more than they already are. They will say I am living there to be near you, that we are," she faltered, blushing. "Let them talk," Kade said firmly. "We will know the truth. You will have your own cabin, your own space. I will not presume anything or expect anything from you. But we will have the opportunity to see each other, to talk, to learn about each other properly. And maybe, in time, we will find that we suit each other. Or maybe we will just be friends. Either way, you will have a safe place to live and work." Grace turned away, moving to the window that looked out over Desdemona's dusty streets. It was a risk, accepting his offer. But what choice did she really have? She could not afford to be prideful, not when she was facing homelessness. And the truth was, she wanted to take the risk. She wanted to see where this connection with Kade might lead. "All right," she said, turning back to him. "I will take the cabin, and I will be grateful for it." Kade's face broke into a genuine smile, and Grace felt her heart stutter at the sight of it. He had a good smile, warm and open. "That is wonderful. When would you like to move your things? I can borrow a wagon from the ranch. The sooner the better, I think. Mrs. Thornton made it clear I am not welcome here." "How about tomorrow morning? I will come by at first light with the wagon." "Tomorrow morning," Grace agreed. After Kade left, Grace sat down at her sewing table, but she could not focus on the work in front of her. Her mind was whirling with everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. Yesterday at this time, she had been a respectable seamstress with a modest but stable life. Now she was an accused thief, saved by a cowboy's lie, about to move out to a ranch to live in a cabin that would put her in daily contact with a man she barely knew but could not stop thinking about. It was reckless. It was scandalous. It was probably the most impulsive decision she had ever made. But it also felt right in a way that Grace could not fully explain. There was something about Kade Callahan that called to her, something that made her want to trust him even though logic said she should be more careful. He had risked his own reputation to save her. He was offering her shelter when no one else would. And when he looked at her with those blue eyes, she felt seen in a way she had never felt before. Grace spent the rest of the day finishing Mrs. Patterson's dress and packing her few belongings. She did not own much: some clothes, her sewing supplies, a few books, a locket that had belonged to her mother. Everything fit into 2 battered trunks and a carpet bag. It was a sparse collection of possessions for 22 years of life, but it was all she had. That evening, she went downstairs for supper in the boarding house dining room. The other tenants were already seated around the long table, and Grace felt their eyes on her as she took her usual place. The conversation, which had been flowing freely when she entered, died down to awkward silence. Mary gave her an encouraging smile from across the table, but the others studiously avoided looking at her. Mrs. Thornton served the meal, a simple fare of beef stew and bread, without saying a word to Grace. Finally, Mr. Henderson, a banker who had lived at the boarding house for years, cleared his throat. "Miss Jensen, I heard that the charges against you were dismissed." "They were," Grace said quietly. "I was innocent." "But the circumstances," Mrs. Wilson, an elderly widow, interjected. "Spending the afternoon alone with a man, it is most improper." Grace set down her fork, her appetite gone. "I did nothing wrong, and I will not apologize for something I did not do." "The appearance of impropriety is just as damaging as the act itself," Mr. Henderson said pompously. "A young woman must be above reproach. Then perhaps this town should be more concerned with the truth than with appearances," Grace shot back, surprising herself with her own vehemence. "Mrs. Vanderborg accused me falsely, and if not for Kade Callahan's testimony, I would be in jail for a crime I did not commit." But instead of questioning why a wealthy woman would lie about a theft, everyone is more interested in gossiping about my character. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I will be leaving tomorrow, so you will all be spared the contamination of my presence very soon." Grace left the dining room without waiting for a response, her hands shaking with anger and hurt. She climbed the stairs to her room and locked the door behind her, leaning against it as she fought back tears. She had always tried so hard to be respectable, to live quietly and cause no trouble. But in the end, none of it had mattered. One false accusation, one lie from a powerful person, and her entire life had been upended. It was a harsh lesson in how precarious a woman's position could be in a place like Desdemona. But tomorrow, she reminded herself, she would leave this boarding house and its judgmental residents behind. She would start fresh at the Lazy J. And maybe, just maybe, she would find something better than the lonely existence she had been living. That night, Grace lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. She thought about Kade, about the way he had looked at her in the courthouse, and the gentle touch of his hand brushing away her tears. She thought about the cabin waiting for her at the ranch, a space of her own where she could work and live without fear of eviction or condemnation. And she thought about the future, uncertain and frightening, but also full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine before. When the first light of dawn crept through her window, Grace was already awake and dressed. She had finished her packing the night before, so there was nothing left to do but wait. She stood by the window, watching the street below as Desdemona slowly came to life. Right on schedule, a wagon rolled into view with Kade at the reins. Grace felt her heart lift at the sight of him, and she grabbed her carpetbag and hurried downstairs. Mrs. Thornton was in the front hall, clearly waiting for her. "I trust you are leaving the room in good condition," she said stiffly. "Everything is exactly as I found it," Grace replied. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Thornton, however brief it was." She did not wait for a response. She pushed through the front door and down the steps to where Kade was already climbing down from the wagon. "Morning," he said, his smile chasing away the last of Grace's apprehension. "Ready to go, more than ready." Kade helped her load her trunks into the back of the wagon, and then he offered her his hand to help her up onto the seat. Grace took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. He held her hand just a moment longer than necessary before letting go, and Grace felt a warm flutter in her chest. They left Desdemona behind as the sun climbed higher in the sky, turning the landscape into a patchwork of gold and brown. The Lazy J was about 5 miles outside of town, nestled in a valley where a small creek provided water year-round. As they drove, Kade pointed out landmarks: the old cottonwood tree that had been struck by lightning last summer, the ridge where wild mustangs sometimes gathered, the bend in the creek where the fishing was best. "How long have you worked at the Lazy J?" Grace asked, grateful for the conversation to fill the silence. 3 years now," Kade replied, guiding the horses with practiced ease. "I came down from Wyoming after spending a few years on the cattle drives. The work was good, but it was hard, always moving, never putting down roots. When I heard that Mr. Jenkins was looking for steady hands, I decided to give it a try." "You like it here?" "I do. Mr. Jenkins is a fair man, treats his workers well. The pay is decent and the work is honest. It is not a big operation like the Vanderborgs, but that suits me fine. I would rather work for a small outfit where every man matters than be just another hand at a massive ranch." Grace looked at him, taking in the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled. "What made you decide to help me yesterday?" "You could have walked right past that courthouse and never looked back." Kade was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "My mother used to say that we are all just one bad day away from needing help ourselves. She taught me that when you see someone in trouble, especially when they are innocent and powerless, you have a duty to step up. I could see you were in trouble, Grace. I could see that you were innocent and that no one was going to help you. So I did what I hoped someone would do for me if I was ever in that position. Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Kade's expression grew sad. "She passed away when I was 16. Fever took her in the space of 3 days. My father died 2 years later, and that is when I headed west to make my own way." "I am sorry for your loss," Grace said softly. "I lost my parents too. My mother when I was 14, my father just over a year ago. That is why I came to Desdemona." I had no family left in Louisiana, no reason to stay. I thought maybe I could make a fresh start out here. And then Mrs. Vander Borg tried to ruin that for you." "She did ruin it," Grace corrected. "Even though the charges were dismissed, I will never be able to live that down in Desdemona. Everyone will always remember me as the girl who was accused of theft, who spent an afternoon alone with a cowboy." Kade glanced at her, and there was something fierce in his expression. "Then we will make them remember you as something else, as a talented seamstress, as a strong woman who did not let false accusations break her, as someone worth knowing." Grace felt tears pricking at her eyes, but these were not tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude and something else, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The Lazy J came into view as they crested a small rise. It was not a grand operation. A modest ranch house, a barn, a few outbuildings and corrals where a handful of horses stood dozing in the morning sun. But it looked well maintained and peaceful, nestled against the backdrop of the Texas hills. Kade drove the wagon past the main house and down a dirt track that led to a small cabin set apart from the other buildings. It was a simple structure, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney and a narrow porch. But the roof looked solid, and there were real glass windows, and Grace felt a surge of relief at the sight of it. "Here we are," Kade said, pulling the wagon to a stop. "Your new home." He helped her down from the wagon and led her up the porch steps. The door was unlocked, and it swung open to reveal a surprisingly clean interior. There was a main room with a small kitchen area in one corner, a pot-bellied stove for heat and cooking, and a table with 2 chairs. A doorway led to a smaller back room that held a narrow bed and a chest of drawers. "I know it is not much," Kade began, but Grace cut him off. "It is perfect," she said, and she meant it. The cabin was small, but it was clean and private and entirely hers. After the cramped room at the boarding house and the constant judgment of Mrs. Thornton and the other tenants, this felt like a palace. Kade looked relieved. "I am glad you think so. I cleaned it up a bit yesterday after I talked to Mr. Jenkins. Swept the floors, made sure the stove was working. There is a well just behind the cabin for water, and the privy is about 20 yards that way." He pointed toward a small structure half hidden by mesquite bushes. "You did not have to do all that. I wanted to." Kade met her eyes. "I want you to be comfortable here, Grace." They spent the next hour unloading her trunks and getting her settled. Kade carried the heavy trunks inside while Grace unpacked her sewing supplies and arranged them on the table. It felt strange to be setting up house with a man she barely knew, but it also felt oddly natural, as if they had been doing this sort of thing together for years. When everything was unloaded, Kade lingered in the doorway, clearly reluctant to leave. "I should get back to work. Mr. Jenkins will be wondering where I have gotten to." "Of course. Thank you for everything, Kade. I do not know how I will ever repay you for your kindness." "You do not need to repay me." Kade settled his hat on his head. "But if you are free this evening, I would be pleased to bring you some supper. Give you a chance to settle in without having to worry about cooking." Grace smiled. "I would like that very much." After he left, Grace stood in the middle of her new cabin and took a deep breath. This was it. This was her new life. It was strange and uncertain and nothing like what she had planned when she came to Texas, but it was also full of promise. She spent the rest of the day making the cabin truly hers. She hung her few dresses in the bedroom, arranged her books on a shelf above the table, and set out her sewing basket where it would catch the best light from the window. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the cabin felt like a home. True to his word, Kade appeared just as the sky was turning pink and orange. He carried a basket that smelled of fresh bread and stew, and Grace invited him in with a smile that felt genuine for the first time in days. They sat at the small table and ate together, and Grace marveled at how easy it was to talk to him. Kade told her about his work on the ranch, about the horses he was training and the fence line that needed mending. Grace told him about her sewing, about the dress she was making for Mrs. Patterson and her hopes to maybe expand her business if she could find enough customers. "You will," Kade said confidently. "You are talented, Grace. People will see that." As the evening wore on and the cabin grew dark, Kade lit the oil lamp on the table and they continued to talk. Grace learned that Kade loved to read, though he had few books of his own. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. She learned that he was thoughtful and kind, that he listened when she spoke, that he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions. And Kade learned about Grace, about her love of sewing that had started when her mother taught her as a child, about her dream of maybe one day opening her own dress shop, about her loneliness since losing her father and coming to Texas alone. "It must have been terrifying," Kade said, "coming to a strange town with no family, no connections." "It was," Grace admitted, "but it also felt like a new beginning. A chance to be more than just the poor seamstress's daughter in a small Louisiana town. I thought maybe here I could make something of myself." "You still can," Kade said firmly. "This setback with Mrs. Vander Borg, it is not the end of your story. It is just a difficult chapter." Grace looked at him across the small table, at his honest face lit by the warm glow of the lamp, and felt something deep and certain settle in her chest. She had known this man for less than 2 days, but already he felt important to her in a way she could not fully explain. "I should go," Kade said reluctantly as the hour grew late. "Let you get some rest. Thank you for supper and for the company. It was my pleasure." Kade stood and collected the empty basket. At the door he paused. "Grace, I know this is all moving very fast. The trial, you moving out here, us spending time together. If it is too much, if you need space, please tell me." "It is fast," Grace agreed. "But it does not feel wrong. Does that make sense?" Kade's expression softened. "It makes perfect sense. I feel the same way." After he left, Grace prepared for bed in her new cabin, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. The distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees, the chirp of crickets in the darkness. It was different from the boarding house, different from anything she had known before. But as she lay in the narrow bed, Grace felt a contentment she had not experienced in a long time. She was safe. She had a home. And she had Kade Callahan, a man who had entered her life like a thunderstorm, sudden and powerful and transformative. She fell asleep with a small smile on her face, dreaming of blue eyes and gentle hands and a future that might hold more happiness than she had ever dared to hope for. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Grace spent her days sewing, and slowly her business began to recover. Mrs. Patterson was delighted with her new Sunday dress and recommended Grace to several of her friends. A few of them were brave enough to ignore the gossip and commission new garments, and Grace was grateful for every order. Kade came by the cabin most evenings after his work was done. Sometimes he brought food, sometimes just his company. They would sit on the porch in the cooling evening air and talk about everything and nothing. Grace learned that Kade had a beautiful singing voice, though he was shy about using it. Kade learned that Grace could do impressive imitations of some of the more pompous townspeople, and he laughed until tears ran down his face when she mimicked Judge Harlan's booming courtroom voice. But it was not all easy. The gossip about Grace and Kade continued to spread through Desdemona, growing more salacious with each retelling. Some people said they were living together in sin at the cabin. Others said that Kade had only defended Grace because she was his mistress. The rumors were hurtful and false, but they persisted. Grace tried to ignore them, but it was hard when she went into town for supplies and felt the weight of judgmental stares. Women who had once greeted her pleasantly now crossed the street to avoid her. Shopkeepers were curt and unwelcoming. Only a few people, like Mary Sullivan and old Dr. Morrison, treated her with kindness. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Grace had moved to the Lazy J, she was in the general store buying thread when she overheard 2 women talking in the next aisle. "It is shameful," one of them said. "That Jensen woman living out at the ranch with that cowboy. Everyone knows what they are doing. Mrs. Vanderborg says the girl is a thief and a liar," the other woman replied. "She says Kade Callahan lied to protect her because she has him under some kind of spell." Grace felt her face burning with humiliation and anger. She wanted to confront them, to defend herself and Kade, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she paid for her thread and left the store with her head held high, refusing to let them see how much their words had hurt. But that evening, when Kade came by, she could not hide her distress. He took one look at her face and immediately set down the basket of food he had brought. "What happened?" he asked, concern filling his eyes. Grace told him about the women in the store, about the ongoing gossip and the way people treated her in town. By the time she finished, she was fighting back tears of frustration. "I am sorry," Kade said quietly. "This is my fault. If I had not given you that alibi, if I had found some other way to help you." "No," Grace cut him off firmly. "You saved me, Kade. Without you, I would be in prison right now. I do not regret anything that has happened except that your reputation is being damaged along with mine." Kade reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and steady. "I do not care about my reputation. I care about you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Grace looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curled around hers, and felt her heart beating faster. "Kade," she whispered, but she did not know how to finish the sentence. He seemed to understand anyway. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to, he leaned closer. Grace did not pull away. Instead, she tilted her face up to his, and when his lips met hers, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The kiss was gentle and sweet, a question and an answer all at once. When they finally pulled apart, Grace felt breathless and flushed, but also more certain than she had ever been about anything. "I am falling in love with you," Kade said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know it is too soon. I know we barely know each other, but I cannot help it. You are everything I have been looking for and did not know I needed." Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "I am falling in love with you too. I think I started falling that first day in the courthouse when you stood up for me. You are the best man I have ever known, Kade Callahan." Kade pulled her into his arms, and Grace rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. When Kade finally left that night, Grace felt as if she were walking on air. The gossip did not matter anymore. The judgment and the stares and the whispered insults, they all faded into insignificance compared to what she and Kade had found together. But their happiness was short-lived. 2 days later, Kade came to the cabin in the middle of the afternoon, his face grim. "What is wrong?" Grace asked immediately, setting down the dress she was working on. "Mrs. Vanderborg's money has been found," Kade said. "Or rather, part of it has." Grace felt her blood run cold. "Where?" "In the room of one of her house servants, a young woman named Emma Pritchard. Sheriff Morton arrested her this morning." Kade ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. "But that is not the worst of it. Mrs. Vanderborg is saying that Emma and you were working together, that you planned the theft together. That is insane. I do not even know Emma Pritchard. I know that, and you know that, but Mrs. Vanderborg is convincing when she wants to be. She is telling anyone who will listen that you are the mastermind behind the theft and that Emma was your accomplice. Grace sank down onto a chair, her legs suddenly weak. This cannot be happening, not again. It is worse than before, Kade said grimly. Before, there was no evidence. Now there is stolen money in Emma's possession, and Mrs. Vanderborg is creating a narrative that ties you to it. What am I going to do? Kade knelt down in front of her, taking her hands in his. You are going to fight back. We both are. We are going to find out the truth about what really happened to that money, and we are going to prove your innocence once and for all. How? I do not know yet, but I am not going to let Mrs. Vanderborg destroy you, Grace. I promise you that. Over the next few days, Kade and Grace worked together to investigate the theft. Kade talked to the other ranch hands and learned that Emma Pritchard had been struggling financially. Her mother was sick and needed expensive medicine. Grace remembered that Mrs. Vanderborg had mentioned the theft occurring at 2:30, but the trial testimony had suggested it could have been any time that afternoon. One evening, as they sat in the cabin going over everything they had learned, Grace had a sudden realization. Kade, what if Mrs. Vanderborg is lying about the whole thing? What do you mean? What if she was never robbed at all? What if she made the whole thing up for some reason we do not understand yet? Kade frowned thoughtfully. But the money was found in Emma's room. That part is true. Is it? Or did someone plant it there to make Emma look guilty? You think Mrs. Vanderborg planted her own money in her servant's room just to frame her? Grace stood and began pacing. I know it sounds far-fetched, but think about it. Mrs. Vanderborg is wealthy and powerful. She could do almost anything she wanted and get away with it. What if she needed to get rid of Emma for some reason? What if this was her way of doing it? But why would she accuse you first? Grace stopped pacing, her mind racing. I do not know. Maybe I was convenient. Maybe she needed a scapegoat and I was available. Or maybe, she paused, a new thought occurring to her, maybe Emma knew something about Mrs. Vanderborg, something she was not supposed to know. Kade stood as well, his expression intent. Like what? I have no idea. But if we can figure that out, we might be able to prove that Mrs. Vanderborg is behind all of this. It took another week of careful investigation, but finally, they got their break. Kade was in town one afternoon when he ran into Dr. Morrison, who pulled him aside with a troubled expression. Mr. Callahan, I heard about the accusations against Miss Jensen, the old doctor said. I want you to know that I do not believe a word of it. That young woman is as honest as they come. Thank you, doctor. That means a lot. Dr. Morrison hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. There is something you should know. About a month ago, Emma Pritchard came to see me. She was very distressed. She said she had discovered something about Mrs. Vanderborg, something scandalous, and she did not know what to do about it. Kade leaned forward, his interest piqued. What did she discover? She would not tell me the details, but she said it involved Mrs. Vanderborg and a man who was not Mr. Vanderborg. I advised her to keep quiet about it, for her own safety, but I suspect she may have tried to use the information to her advantage. You think she tried to blackmail Mrs. Vanderborg? I cannot say for certain, but it seems possible. And if that is the case, then Mrs. Vanderborg would have had a powerful motive to discredit and remove Emma from her household. Kade thanked the doctor and immediately went to find Grace. When he told her what he had learned, her eyes widened with understanding. That is it, she said. Emma discovered that Mrs. Vanderborg was having an affair. She tried to blackmail her, and Mrs. Vanderborg struck back by framing her for theft. And she tried to frame me first because, Grace paused, thinking, because I do alterations for Mrs. van der Borg. I have been to her house several times for fittings. She knew I would be a believable suspect. But how do we prove any of this? Grace thought for a moment. We need to talk to Emma. She is the only one who knows the whole truth. Getting access to Emma Pritchard was not easy. She was being held in the small jail behind the sheriff's office, and Sheriff Morton was not inclined to let just anyone visit her. But Kade had an idea. "Mary Sullivan," he said. "She is a schoolteacher, a respectable woman. If she asked to visit Emma to bring her religious comfort or something like that, the sheriff might allow it." Grace immediately went to see Mary, who agreed to help without hesitation. 2 days later, Mary was granted permission to visit Emma, ostensibly to read scripture to her and pray for her soul. When Mary returned, she brought news that confirmed their suspicions. Emma had indeed discovered Mrs. van der Borg having secret meetings with a man named William Garrett, a businessman from Dallas. She had made the mistake of confronting Mrs. van der Borg and hinting that she might tell Mr. van der Borg unless she was given more money. Mrs. van der Borg had responded by planting money in Emma's room and then reporting it stolen. She had tried to frame Grace first to create confusion and make the eventual accusation against Emma seem more credible. But when Kade had provided Grace with an alibi, Mrs. van der Borg had been forced to move directly to framing Emma. "Emma is terrified," Mary reported. "She knows no one will believe her word against Mrs. van der Borg's. She thinks she is going to hang for a theft she did not commit." Grace felt a surge of righteous anger. "We have to stop this. We have to expose Mrs. van der Borg for what she really is." But proving it was another matter. Emma's word against Mrs. van der Borg's would mean nothing in court. They needed solid evidence, something that would force people to believe the truth. Kade had an idea. William Garrett. If we can find him and get him to testify about his relationship with Mrs. van der Borg, it would give credibility to Emma's story. But why would he admit to such a thing? It would ruin his reputation too. Maybe he does not know that Mrs. van der Borg has framed someone for theft to keep him secret. Maybe he would have a conscience about an innocent woman being punished. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance they had. Kade took several days off from the ranch and traveled to Dallas to find William Garrett. Grace waited anxiously at the cabin, continuing her sewing work but barely able to focus on it. When Kade finally returned, he had news. "I found Garrett. He is a widower, wealthy, respectable. When I told him what Mrs. van der Borg had done to protect their secret, he was appalled. He said he had ended the affair weeks ago and had no idea she was capable of such cruelty. He has agreed to come to Desdemona and testify if necessary." Grace threw her arms around Kade, overcome with relief and gratitude. "You did it. You actually did it." "We did it," Kade corrected, holding her close. "Together." Armed with William Garrett's testimony, they went to Judge Harlan. At first the judge was skeptical, but when Garrett himself appeared and confirmed the affair, Harlan's expression grew stern. "These are serious allegations," he said. "If they are true, then Mrs. van der Borg has committed a grave injustice against 2 innocent women." A new hearing was convened, and this time the courthouse was even more packed than it had been for Grace's trial. Emma Pritchard was brought from the jail, thin and pale but with hope in her eyes for the first time in weeks. Mrs. van der Borg arrived with her lawyer, confident and imperious, clearly expecting to see Emma convicted and Grace's reputation destroyed permanently. But when William Garrett took the stand and calmly, clearly described his affair with Mrs. van der Borg and her panicked reaction when Emma had discovered them, the color drained from her face. Emma testified next, telling the whole story of what she had seen and how Mrs. Vanderborg had responded to her attempt at blackmail. She admitted her own wrongdoing in trying to extort money, but she insisted that she had never stolen anything. Finally, Grace took the stand and described how Mrs. Vanderborg had first tried to frame her and how only Kade's intervention had saved her. Judge Harlan listened to all of it with a face like thunder. When the testimony was complete, he turned to Mrs. Vanderborg. "Madam, do you have anything to say in your own defense, Mrs.?" Vanderborg stood, her hands trembling but her voice still haughty. "This is all lies and slander. I am a respectable woman, and I will not be slandered by servants and seamstresses and cowboys. You are a woman who has committed perjury and false accusation," Judge Harlan said coldly. "You have attempted to destroy the lives of 2 innocent women to cover your own indiscretions. The charges against Emma Pritchard are dismissed. Furthermore, I am fining you $500 for perjury and false testimony. And I am ordering you to publicly apologize to both Miss Jensen and Miss Pritchard." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Mrs. Vanderborg looked as if she had been slapped. "I will do no such thing." "Then I will add contempt of court to your charges and increase the fine to $1,000, Judge Harlan said. "The choice is yours, Mrs. Vanderborg." It was one of the most satisfying moments of Grace's life, watching the proud, cruel woman who had tried to destroy her forced to stand before the court and apologize. Mrs. Vanderborg's words were stiff and insincere, but they were public, and that was what mattered. When it was over, Emma Pritchard was released from jail, and Grace's name was finally, truly cleared. The gossip would not stop immediately, Grace knew, but the truth was out there now, and people would have to acknowledge it. Outside the courthouse, Emma approached Grace with tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for fighting for the truth. You could have just been grateful that you were cleared and forgotten about me, but you did not." Grace took her hands. "We both deserved justice. I am just glad we got it." Emma left Desdemona that same day, going to live with relatives in San Antonio. Grace never saw her again, but she heard later that Emma had found work as a cook and was doing well. As for Grace and Kade, the vindication brought a new freedom to their relationship. With the cloud of scandal lifted, they could court openly and honestly. Kade began coming to Sunday services in town just so he could sit beside Grace. They took long walks along Willow Creek, where Kade had claimed they had been that first fateful afternoon. They talked about their dreams and their pasts, about their hopes for the future. 3 months after the second trial, as the Texas autumn began to cool the scorching summer heat, Kade took Grace to a spot overlooking the Lazy J Ranch, where the sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. "Grace Jensen," he said, taking her hands in his. "I know we have not been courting for very long by conventional standards, but I feel like I have known you forever. You are the strongest, bravest, kindest woman I have ever met, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Grace felt tears of joy streaming down her face as she nodded. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Kade pulled a simple gold band from his pocket and slipped it onto her finger. It was not fancy, but Grace loved it instantly. It was honest and real, just like the man who had given it to her. They were married in December, in a small ceremony at the church in Desdemona. Mary Sullivan stood up as Grace's witness, and another ranch hand from the Lazy J served as Kade's. Dr. Morrison attended, beaming with approval, and even a few of the townspeople who had gossiped so viciously came to offer their congratulations. Shame-faced but sincere, Mr. Jenkins gave them a wedding gift: the cabin where Grace had been living, along with 5 acres of land around it. "You two have been through enough," he said gruffly. "Time you had a real home of your own." Grace and Kade moved into the cabin as husband and wife, and Grace had never been happier. She continued her sewing work, and her business grew steadily as her skill became more widely known. Kade continued working at the Lazy J, but he also began building up a small herd of cattle on their own land, planning for the day when they might have their own ranch. Their first child, a son they named James after Kade's father, was born in the autumn of 1879. Grace held the tiny, squalling baby in her arms and looked up at Kade with wonder in her eyes. "We made this," she said softly. "We made this perfect little person." Kade kissed her forehead, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "We did, and we are going to give him the best life we can." James was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Catherine, after Grace's mother, and then 3 years after that by another son they called Michael. The cabin grew crowded with the sounds of children laughing and crying and playing, and Grace and Kade added on 2 more rooms to accommodate their growing family. The years passed in a blur of hard work and simple joys. Kade's cattle herd grew, and eventually he had enough saved to buy more land adjacent to their original 5 acres. Grace's sewing business became so successful that she had to hire 2 assistants to help her keep up with all the orders. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable and secure. More importantly, they were happy. Grace never forgot the fear and desperation of those early days in Desdemona, when she had stood falsely accused with no one to help her. But she also never forgot the miracle of Kade stepping forward when she needed him most, risking everything to save a woman he barely knew. "You ever regret it?" she asked him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their children play in the yard. James was 10 now, Catherine 8, and Michael 5. "Lying for me that first day in the courthouse," Kade considered the question seriously. "I regret the necessity of it. I wish you had never been put in that position, but I do not regret the choice I made. That lie led to the truth eventually, and it led to us. How could I regret that?" Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. "I love you, Kade Callahan. I have loved you since that first day, and I will love you until the day I die." "And I love you, Grace Callahan. You are my heart, my home, my everything." As they sat there in the fading light, watching their children and listening to the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling down for the night, Grace reflected on how far they had come. From that desperate moment in the courthouse to this place of love and security, it had been a journey neither of them could have imagined. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy them had instead become the foundation of their love story. The lie that Kade had told to save her had led them to discover the truth together, and in the process, they had found something more valuable than any amount of gold. They had found each other. Mrs. van der Borg had long since left Desdemona, her reputation in tatters after the truth came out. Her husband had divorced her quietly and sent her away to live with relatives back east. Emma Pritchard had built a new life in San Antonio and occasionally sent letters to Grace, updating her on her own happiness. As for Grace and Kade, they continued to build their life together, year after year. They weathered droughts and floods, lean times and prosperous ones. They raised their children with love and taught them the value of honesty, hard work, and standing up for what was right. When James turned 18, he went to work with his father on the ranch, which had grown to over 200 acres. Catherine showed a talent for business and began helping Grace manage the sewing enterprise, which now employed 5 women and served customers from 3 counties. Michael, the youngest, surprised everyone by developing a passion for learning and eventually went off to study law in Austin, determined to become a lawyer who would defend those who could not defend themselves. Grace and Kade grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. The passion of their early courtship mellowed into something richer and more enduring, a partnership built on trust and respect and genuine affection. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Kade surprised Grace with a trip to San Antonio. It was the first time either of them had been to a real city, and they spent a week exploring the markets and restaurants, marveling at the electric lights and the bustle of urban life. But as wonderful as it was, they were both relieved to return to their ranch, to the quiet and the open spaces and the life they had built together. This was home. This was where they belonged. In the summer of 1904, when Grace was 48 and Kade was 52, they became grandparents for the first time. James and his wife Sarah welcomed a daughter, and when Grace held her granddaughter for the first time, she was transported back to that terrifying day in the courthouse so many years ago. If Kade had not stood up for her that day, none of this would exist. Her children, her grandchildren, the life she had built, it all traced back to that one moment of courage and kindness. "What are you thinking about?" Kade asked, coming to stand beside her as she rocked the baby. "About how one decision can change everything," Grace said softly. "About how you saved my life that day in court, and in doing so, you gave me all of this." Kade put his arm around her shoulders. "We saved each other, Grace. You gave me a reason to be brave, a reason to stand up and do the right thing even when it was hard. You made me a better man." Grace looked up at him, at the face she had loved for so many years, now lined with age but still achingly familiar and dear. "We were lucky to find each other." "We were," Kade agreed. "But it was not just luck, it was choice. I chose to help you, you chose to trust me. We chose each other, again and again, every day for 25 years. That is not luck, Grace. That is love." As the sun set over their ranch, painting the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace and Kade stood together with their granddaughter sleeping peacefully in Grace's arms. They had weathered so much together, scandal and hardship, triumph and loss. But through it all, they had held on to each other, and that had made all the difference. The years continued to pass, bringing new joys and sorrows. Catherine married a banker from Dallas and gave them 2 more grandchildren. Michael graduated from law school and set up practice in Desdemona, where he became known for his fierce advocacy for those who could not afford expensive lawyers. James took over the management of the ranch and expanded it even further, making it one of the most successful operations in the county. Grace's sewing business eventually passed to Catherine, who transformed it into a thriving dress shop that attracted customers from as far away as Fort Worth. Grace herself retired from the daily work, but continued to take on special projects that interested her. Kade worked on the ranch well into his 60s, refusing to slow down even when his children begged him to take it easier. "I am a working man," he would say with a grin. "What else would I do with my time?" But eventually, age caught up with even Kade's stubbornness. At 67, he finally agreed to let James handle the day-to-day running of the ranch while he took on a more supervisory role. He spent his mornings riding the fence line on his favorite horse, checking on the cattle and the land he loved. His afternoons were spent with Grace, sitting on the porch they had expanded over the years, talking and laughing and simply enjoying each other's company. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a big party. Half the town of Desdemona showed up, along with friends and family from across Texas. There were speeches and toasts, food and music, and Grace felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and respect. "To Grace and Kade Callahan," Dr. Morrison said, raising his glass. The old doctor was well into his 80s now, but still sharp as ever. "Two people who showed us all what true love and courage look like. May we all be so lucky as to find what they have found in each other." Everyone cheered and drank, and Grace felt tears streaming down her face. Kade squeezed her hand and smiled at her, that same warm, open smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. "I would do it all again," he whispered to her. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I would do it all again just to end up here with you." "So would I," Grace whispered back. "So would I, my love." As the party continued around them, Grace reflected on the incredible journey her life had been. She had started out as a poor seamstress, alone and friendless in a harsh frontier town. She had been falsely accused and nearly destroyed by the malice of a powerful woman. But she had survived, and more than that, she had thrived. She had found love with a man who had risked everything to save her. She had built a family and a business and a life that exceeded her wildest dreams. She had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs. She had known sorrow and joy, fear and hope, despair and love. And through it all, Kade had been beside her, steady and true, the foundation upon which everything else was built. The party lasted well into the night, with music and dancing under the stars. Grace and Kade slipped away after a while, tired but happy, and walked hand in hand back to their cabin. It was much larger now than it had been when Grace first moved in, with multiple additions and improvements. But the core of it was still that original simple structure where they had fallen in love. Inside, they sat together on the sofa that Kade had made with his own hands 30 years ago. And they talked quietly about the party, about their children and grandchildren, about the life they had shared. "We did well, did we not?" Kade asked, his arm around Grace's shoulders. "We did very well," Grace agreed, snuggling close to him. "Better than I ever imagined possible. When I stood up in that courthouse and lied for you, I had no idea what I was starting," Kade said thoughtfully. "I just knew I could not let an innocent woman be destroyed. I could not stand by and do nothing. And I will be grateful for that decision for the rest of my life," Grace said. "You were my hero that day, Kade Callahan. You still are." Kade kissed the top of her head. "You were worth saving. You are worth everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds outside. An owl hooted in the distance. The wind rustled through the trees. From the barn, one of the horses nickered softly. "Grace," Kade said eventually, "do you remember what you said to me the day we got married?" "I said a lot of things that day," Grace replied with a smile. "You said that you would love me until the day you died. Do you still mean that?" Grace pulled back slightly so she could look into his eyes. "I mean it more than ever. You are my heart, Kade. You always will be." "And you are mine," Kade said softly. "You have been from that very first day, even when I did not fully understand it myself. The moment I saw you standing in that courtroom, so frightened but so brave, something in me recognized something in you, like we were meant to find each other." "I believe we were," Grace said. "I believe that everything that happened, all the hardship and the pain, it was all leading us to each other." They made their way to bed eventually, tired from the long day of celebration. As Grace lay beside her husband of 40 years, listening to his steady breathing, she felt a profound sense of peace and contentment. She had lived a good life, a full life. She had loved and been loved in return. She had raised children who were good people, who contributed to the world in meaningful ways. She had built a business that provided employment and beautiful things. She had made a difference, however small, in her corner of the world. And it had all started with a cowboy's lie told in a courthouse on a hot August day in 1878. The years that followed their 40th anniversary were gentle ones. Kade and Grace settled into the comfortable rhythms of old age, surrounded by family and friends. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own. They saw the world change around them, with automobiles appearing on the streets of Desdemona and electricity finally reaching their ranch. But some things never changed. Kade's love for Grace remained as strong as ever, and Grace's love for Kade never wavered. They had been through too much together, built too much together, to ever take each other for granted. On a warm spring morning in 1915, when Grace was 59 and Kade was 63, they sat together on their porch as they did most mornings. Kade was reading the newspaper, occasionally commenting on some bit of news, while Grace worked on a quilt for their newest great-grandchild. "Listen to this," Kade said, rattling the paper. "They are saying that women might get the right to vote soon. Can you imagine?" Grace smiled. "I can imagine it very well. It is about time, if you ask me." "You would have made a fine voter," Kade said seriously. "You have always had a good head on your shoulders, better than most men I know. You would say that because you are my husband and you love me. I would say it because it is true." Kade set down the paper and looked at her. "You have always been the smartest person I know, Grace. The bravest, too. I have been lucky to have you by my side all these years." Grace set down her quilt and moved to sit beside him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We have been lucky to have each other." They sat like that for a long time, watching the ranch wake up around them. James was out in the fields with several of the hands, checking on the spring calves. In the distance, they could see Catherine's automobile kicking up dust as she drove out from town for her weekly visit. "This is a good life," Kade said quietly. "A very good life. The best," Grace agreed. And it was. Through all the trials and triumphs, the hardships and the joys, they had built something lasting and true. They had created a legacy of love and integrity that would outlive them both. When Kade passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 71, Grace grieved deeply, but without bitterness. They had been married for 48 years, and not a day of it had been wasted. He had loved her until his last breath, and she had loved him just as completely. At his funeral, the church in Desdemona was packed with people whose lives had been touched by Kade Callahan. The cowboy who had stood up in a courthouse and told a lie to save an innocent woman had gone on to live a life of remarkable honesty and integrity. He had been a good husband, a devoted father, a fair employer, and a true friend. Grace stood beside his grave as the sun set over the Texas hills, and she thought about the day they had met. The day her world had been turned upside down by false accusations, and Kade had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. "Thank you," she whispered to the wind. "Thank you for 48 beautiful years. Thank you for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Thank you for the life we built together. I will love you always, Kade Callahan, until the day I join you again." Grace lived for another 12 years after Kade's death, surrounded by her family and the life they had created together. She continued to work on her quilts and her sewing, to play with her great-grandchildren, to sit on the porch and remember. When she passed away quietly at the age of 83, she was laid to rest beside Kade in the Desdemona cemetery. On her headstone, her children inscribed the words, "Grace Jensen Callahan. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she loved bravely and lived honestly." The story of Grace and Kade became something of a legend in Desdemona. People told it to their children and grandchildren. The tale of the cowboy who had stood before a judge and lied to save an innocent woman, and how that one act of courage had blossomed into a love story that lasted nearly half a century. The cabin they had shared still stood on the ranch, carefully maintained by their descendants as a reminder of where it all began. Inside, you could still see the table where Grace had done her sewing, the stove where Kade had cooked countless meals for his family, the bedroom where they had dreamed together and planned their future. And if you stood on the porch at sunset on a warm summer evening, you could almost imagine them there still. The tall cowboy with the honest blue eyes and the small seamstress with the determined spirit, sitting side by side as they had done for so many years, holding hands and watching the Texas sky turn gold and crimson. Their love had started with a lie told in the service of justice, but everything that followed had been true and real and lasting. They had built a life together that withstood scandal and hardship, that grew richer and deeper with every passing year. They had raised a family that carried their values forward into future generations. They had loved each other with a devotion that never wavered, never faltered, never failed. In the end, that was their legacy. Not the land or the business or the material things they had accumulated, but the love they had shared and the example they had set. They had shown that one moment of courage could change everything. That standing up for what was right, even at great personal cost, was always worth it. That true love was not just a fairy tale, but something real and attainable if you were brave enough to reach for it. Grace and Kade Callahan had lived a life that mattered. They had made their corner of the world better simply by being in it. They had loved deeply, lived honestly, and left behind a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. And it had all started on a hot August day in 1878, when a cowboy stood before a judge and said 5 words that would change 2 lives forever. "She was with me." Those words had been a lie, but they had led to a truth more powerful than any falsehood. The truth of love that endures, of courage that transforms, of 2 souls finding each other against all odds and choosing to build something beautiful together. That was the story of Grace and Kade, and it was a story worth remembering, a story worth telling, a story that proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the most extraordinary lives begin with the simplest acts of kindness and courage. And in the hearts of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in the stories told around dinner tables and on front porches across Texas, Grace and Kade Callahan lived on, a testament to the enduring power of love and the difference one brave decision could make. Their story had a beginning in that courthouse in Desdemona, and it had an ending in the cemetery where they rested side by side. But in between, in between was a lifetime of joy and sorrow, laughter and tears, hardship and triumph. In between was a love story for the ages, a romance that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger for it. And that, in the end, was the most important thing. Not that they had lived perfect lives, for they had made mistakes like everyone does. Not that they had achieved great wealth or fame, for they had remained humble ranchers and business people. But that they had loved each other truly and completely, that they had stood by each other through everything, that they had built a life together that was rich in the things that truly mattered. Grace Jensen and Kade Callahan had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they had made something beautiful from the chaos and injustice that had threatened to destroy them. They had turned accusation into vindication, scandal into love story, fear into hope. And in doing so, they had proven that even in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Old West, love could bloom and flourish and endure. That kindness could triumph over cruelty. That truth could overcome lies. That 2 people who chose each other, who stood by each other, who loved each other with everything they had, could create something that would last not just for their lifetime, but for generations to come. That was the gift Grace and Kade gave to the world. That was their story. And it was a story with a truly happy ending, the kind that reminds us all that love, true love, is always worth fighting for.